I'd like to take a moment to share with you what I thought was a very good conversation with a new client of mine and one of my favorites already. It's my hope rather that what I shared with her is a help to you the way it was to her. She's 32 years old. She's a single mother of a 6-year-old son. She said, Doc, I just saw the release of your book, Letting Go. And I just finished the book, 5 Areas of Healing. I pre-ordered a copy of Letting Go because I'm incredibly depressed over a recent breakup. I said, well, tell me about it. She said, well, he was a solid guy. We dated for about 3 years. And if I'm being honest with you, I believe it was me. So why do you say that? And you could see her getting teary-eyed. And she even said to me, Doc, I don't want to cry here. I've done a lot of crying. I want to talk to you as sober-minded as I possibly can. I said, well, ma'am, crying doesn't mean you're not sober-minded. It just could be that you're feeling the emotions, not only of the moment, but also of the breakup again, and that's okay. And she thanked me for giving her grace. And again, a very kind lady. She said, I think I did a lot of self-sabotaging. If I'm looking at this in hindsight, he's very secure. He showed up secure from day one. Through his security, he set up a lot of boundaries in our relationship. I was not used to a man having so many boundaries. I was frankly used to men letting me have my way. I heard you do a live recently where you talked about women who scream about having their way, oftentimes being broken women. And that really resonated with me because we had just broken up not too much around the time of that live. And that really resonated with me. And I hurt myself a lot in that message because I very much believe I self-sabotage. He was secure and my anxiousness eventually wore him down. I really feel like that I showed up anxious in terms of the attention that I demanded from him. The other things that I demanded from him in terms of how he showed up and what I needed him to do for me. And everything was so me-centered that in hindsight, I believe it was just based out of pure insecurity. And she started to officially cry. And I gave her a second and I said, ma'am, I commend your honesty. You know, I've been doing this work for a very long time now. And when you do this work, it's refreshing to see people show up on screen and honestly admit that sometimes they're the problem. I said, so this is refreshing. But what I know, ma'am, is that many people fail to use self-awareness in a breakup. And when we don't use self-awareness in a breakup, then we're not operating in what self-awareness is, which is honesty about who we are, where we are, and what we're doing at any given time. And so you read the 5 Areas of Healing. You know, I spent a significant amount of time talking about self-awareness in that book because everything starts with honesty. Why? Because even in a breakup, it takes honesty to admit 2 things. I said, number one, it takes honesty to admit that maybe you were the problem. And look, just browse social media. Look at the people on social media. Look at the people in your family. Look at the people that you work with. They go through breakups. And we are so quick to say that everybody else was the problem. Everybody else was the issue. Everybody else didn't show up right. Everybody else didn't show up appropriately. Let me tell you something in this work. I've learned that people who spend a lot of time pointing their finger at other people oftentimes have multiple fingers that are pointing back at them and multiple mirrors they need to stare in. I said, ma'am, the very fact that you are able to acknowledge that maybe you were the problem says to me that you are attempting to operate in self-awareness. I said, the other thing that honesty helps us to admit is that one person's blessing can absolutely turn out to be somebody else's pain. And I always find this, really interesting. Who's really perfect in this space? Yes, you can be secure, but just because you're secure doesn't mean you don't have flaws. And this is what I try to get secure people to understand. People become secure and feel like they're healed mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, financially. And all of a sudden they feel like they're on this mountain where they can never be wrong. And that can very much come across as arrogance and can manifest itself in, say, like controlling behaviors or manipulative behaviors. Just because you're secure doesn't mean you're perfect, but it does mean you've reached a certain plateau and point that a lot of people have not worked to achieve. And that's okay, but it doesn't mean you're perfect. Because at the end of the day, you might be somebody's gift today, but you possibly could have been somebody's nightmare yesterday. And it's so funny to me. When we are broken, that is absolutely the case. You might be walking around right now thinking that you could be somebody's gift. But to this man that showed up secure, that you believe you were probably the problem, you are a nightmare to him. And the fact that you can acknowledge this says, Doc, I'm trying to operate in self-awareness. I'm trying to operate in honesty. I said, does this make sense? She said, it makes crystal clear sense, Doc, that while I realize I've got some flaws and challenges that I need to overcome, and I think I'm a great person and would make someone a great partner, I do realize that I did not show up well for him. And in doing so, it's making me feel a certain kind of way when I think about that breakup and it's impacting whether or not I feel like I will be good enough for someone else. I said, I think that's where we part ways here. You can be good for someone else, but we've got to get to a place where we have evolved from this past situation. I said, because we shouldn't evaluate ourselves by how good of a catch we are. I said, man, we should start evaluating ourselves in this dating space by the person we let get away. I said, ma'am, the best way you can evaluate yourself in this dating space is not to evaluate where you are mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, financially. That's a part of it, obviously. But a better and more thorough way is to take that and couple it with the fact, think about the partners you've had in your life that were good catches, that you were the problem and they got away from you. It wasn't that you got away from them. They got away from you. I said, because when we do this, it forces us to become comfortable with words like guilt and shame. I said, ma'am, do you want to know why it's so much piss in the dating water? Because this culture that we live in, this time that we live in, people don't like to be comfortable with guilt and shame. We think guilt and shame are curse words. We think guilt and shame are words that don't belong to us, they're words that we should never feel. I said, no, we need to bring back guilt and we need to bring back shame. Why? Because if we bring back guilt and shame in the context of inappropriate and wrong behavior, guilt and shame can absolutely become tools that help us to become the best version of ourselves. Why do you think so many people are walking around? I said to her, I said, man, why do you think so many men and women are walking around here thinking they're God's gift? But if you talk to them and you're secure and healed for real, you can point out all the flaws that they have. And many of them are too oblivious to those flaws because they're not functioning in self-awareness. They are absolutely insensitive to the idea of guilt and shame and what that can do on their healing journey. I said, ma'am, I say we bring back guilt and shame. And when we operate in self-awareness, it helps us to become comfortable with those things. It helps us to realize that while we might think we're God's gift, we could be somebody else's nightmare. I said both of these words, guilt and shame, are appropriate when we're wrong. She's writing this down. She said, Doc, pause. I explicitly remember her saying that. She said, Doc, pause. Let me write this down. I said, when both are appropriate when we are wrong, both guilt and shame are appropriate when we're in the wrong, and we need to learn how to embrace it. I said, ma'am, have you seen the movie Boomerang? She said, with Eddie Murphy. I said, yeah. She said, I know exactly where you're going here. I said, Eddie Murphy thought he was God's gift, didn't he? She said, he did. I said, he seemed like a pretty dapper guy, didn't he? She said, yeah. I said, he seemed successful, didn't he? She said, yeah. I said, he seemed like he had his stuff together, right? He could get almost any woman he wanted, right? She said, yeah. I said, but what was wrong with Eddie Murphy? She said, well, he lacked emotional maturity. He was a player. He didn't want to settle down. I said, and then what eventually happened to him? She said, well, he met Halle Berry and he fell in love with Halle Berry and wanted to settle down. But he was still playing games and couldn't release his games and didn't realize he wanted her until she no longer wanted him. I said, and then what happened to Eddie Murphy? She put her pen down. She put her hands over her eyes and started to cry. I said, man, why are you crying? This is not even about you. She said, I didn't cheat on my partner, Doc. She said, but this is making me understand exactly what you're saying, that I really didn't appreciate who he was until I experienced the guilt and shame of losing him. I said, ma'am, that's the bar for this lesson, because a lot of times we don't appreciate what we could have had until we have to feel the guilt and shame of not having them. And this is what you're going through. And I want you to know this from me, someone who's an expert in this space, that what you're feeling right now, this guilt and shame, while it may not feel good, while it may not feel good to you, it may not be comfortable to you, the reality is this guilt and shame that you feel is absolutely good for you. Because we got to start evaluating ourselves, not by how great we think we are. Sometimes we can look at what got away, and it will help us realize how much more work we have to do. I said, and that's exactly what happened to Eddie Murphy. I said, and ma'am, that's what you're going through right now. So many people in this space are concerned with how they feel over a breakup instead of being concerned about what they learned from the breakup. Eddie Murphy spent all kinds of time in that movie walking around trying to get people to feel sorry for him instead of focusing on the lesson he needed to learn. I said, and ma'am, that's what I want to encourage you to do. Sometimes if we're all honest, when breakups occur, it ain't always the other person's fault. I said, ma'am, you've been honest enough to admit that. I said, let's take that honesty a step further. Now allow that honesty to bring about the natural feelings of guilt and shame and feel them. Yes, it's going to hurt, but I want you to feel them and embrace them. And through embracing those natural feelings of guilt and shame, you learn how to evaluate what you need to do by the lessons created from the one who got away from you. I said, does that make sense? She said, Doc, I've never had anybody explain it like this. I said, I want to take it a step further and I'll let you go. I said, man, when we fail a test, the test isn't the problem. The test that you fail in life is never the problem. What is the problem is our comprehension and preparedness. How much did we comprehend from the test that we failed, and how prepared were we to take it? I said, ma'am, you probably weren't prepared for this secure man that you were with. I said, and clearly you did not comprehend until now that there were some lessons you needed to learn from that breakup. You did have a level of awareness, but I believe after this call, you recognize that there were some things that you really need to work on, that guilt and shame are serving as alerts and alarms to say that we weren't quite as ready as we thought we were, that we weren't quite where we needed to be to have the kind of partner and spouse that we wanted to have. I said, is that correct? She said, that's spot on. I said, so ma'am, sometimes we need to evaluate ourselves by the one who got away. And that requires us to be honest about how we've shown up in spaces and how we did not. And it requires us to also embrace the guilt and the shame associated with those experiences so that we can learn from them. She was very grateful. We have done 2 sessions since then. She is making incredible strides really fast. I'm not surprised. I said to her from the beginning, and I repeated to her at our 3rd session, I said, man, when people function in self-awareness, they see results really fast. And she's really proof positive that when we function in self-awareness, we can embrace guilt and shame, but we can learn from the experiences that didn't work so that they can make us better. I hope this story made sense. If it did, type church in the comments with 3 R's. And then remember, you've got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you.